Apple nearly went bankrupt, then returned and changed the world with the iPhone. The story of Apple begins in California with two friends who had very different talents. Steve Wozniak was a gifted engineer who loved building electronic devices. Steve Jobs was not as technically skilled, but he understood something equally important: how technology could be turned into a product people would actually want. In 1976, Wozniak designed a small personal computer called the Apple I. Compared with modern computers, it was extremely basic. It did not include a monitor, keyboard, mouse, or protective case. Buyers received an assembled circuit board and had to provide many of the other parts themselves. Jobs believed they could sell it. On April 1, 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne formed the Apple Computer Company. Wayne prepared some of the company's early documents and created its first logo. But he was worried that the new business could leave him responsible for its debts. Only days later, he sold his ownership share. At the time, it may have seemed like a safe decision. Nobody knew that Apple would eventually become one of the most valuable and influential companies in history. The Apple I helped the founders begin their business, but the Apple II transformed Apple into a real computer company. Released in 1977, the Apple II looked more like a finished consumer product. It came inside a plastic case, included a keyboard, and could connect to a television. It also displayed color graphics, which was impressive for an early personal computer. The Apple II became useful for more than programming and entertainment. Software such as VisiCalc, one of the earliest spreadsheet programs, allowed businesses to perform financial calculations electronically. Suddenly, personal computers were not simply expensive toys for hobbyists. They could save time, organize information, and help companies make decisions. Sales increased, Apple expanded, and in 1980 the company entered the stock market. The small operation started by two friends had become one of the leading businesses in the growing personal computer industry. But Steve Jobs was already searching for the next major idea. Most early computers required users to type commands. Jobs believed computers could become easier to use if people could control them by pointing at visual objects on a screen. After visiting the Xerox Research Center in California, Apple became increasingly interested in graphical interfaces, windows, icons, and the computer mouse. Apple released the Lisa computer in 1983. It introduced several advanced ideas, but it was extremely expensive and failed to attract enough customers. Apple tried again with a more affordable machine. On January 24, 1984, Steve Jobs unveiled the Macintosh. The Macintosh allowed users to click icons, open windows, move files, and create drawings using a mouse. Apple promoted the computer with its famous 1984 television commercial, which presented the Macintosh as a rebellious machine challenging a dull and controlled computer industry. The launch turned Steve Jobs into one of the most recognizable figures in technology. However, the excitement did not immediately produce the sales Apple expected. The Macintosh had limited memory, few available programs, and a high price compared with some competing computers. Behind the scenes, Apple's leadership was also becoming divided. Jobs had recruited former Pepsi executive John Sculley to become Apple's chief executive. Jobs reportedly challenged him with a famous question: did he want to continue selling sugar water or help change the world? But their partnership did not last. Jobs was visionary and persuasive, but he could also be demanding, confrontational, and unpredictable. As Macintosh sales struggled, Jobs and Sculley disagreed about the company's direction and who should control important decisions. In 1985, Apple's board supported Sculley and removed Jobs from his management responsibilities. Rather than remain at Apple without real authority, Jobs left the company he had helped create. He founded a new computer company called Next. He also purchased a small computer animation business that eventually became Pixar, the studio behind films such as Toy Story. Apple continued without him. For several years, the Macintosh remained popular among designers, publishers, schools, and creative professionals, but the wider computer market was changing quickly. Computers running Microsoft Windows became more common. They were produced by many different companies. giving customers a wider selection of machines at different prices. Apple controlled both its hardware and its operating system. This helped create a more consistent experience, but Apple computers were often more expensive and had fewer software options. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Apple released many different Macintosh models. The product lineup became confusing. Some computers had similar names, small differences, and unclear purposes. Apple also experimented with new categories. One example was the Newton, a handheld digital assistant released in 1993. It allowed users to store notes, contacts, and schedules, but its handwriting recognition feature became famous for making mistakes. The Newton contained ideas that would later appear in smartphones and tablets, but at the time, it was expensive and unreliable. Meanwhile, Apple repeatedly struggled to create a modern replacement for its aging Macintosh operating system. By the middle of the 1990s, the company was losing money, losing customers, and losing direction. Some people believed Apple might disappear completely. Then the company made a decision that brought its former founder back. Apple needed a new operating system. In 1996, it agreed to purchase Next, the computer company Steve Jobs had founded after leaving Apple. Next's software would become the foundation for Apple's future operating systems. The acquisition also returned Jobs to Apple after more than a decade away. He initially came back as an advisor, but he quickly gained greater control over the company. Jobs believed Apple's biggest problem was a lack of focus. The company was producing too many computers and supporting too many unsuccessful projects. Jobs reduced the product lineup to a simple grid: computers for consumers and professionals, available as desktops or portable machines. Projects were canceled. Products were eliminated. Apple focused its limited resources on creating only a few machines. In 1997, Apple also announced a surprising partnership with Microsoft. Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple and promised to continue producing Microsoft Office for Macintosh computers. For years, the two companies had been presented as bitter rivals. When Microsoft founder Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen during an Apple presentation, some members of the audience booed. But the agreement gave Apple money, stability, and confidence at a moment when it badly needed all three. Apple was still alive. Now it needed a product that would prove the company was different. In 1998, Apple introduced the iMac. At the time, many computers looked like boring beige boxes. The iMac looked completely different. Its computer and monitor were combined inside a rounded, translucent case. It appeared in bright colors and looked more like modern furniture than office equipment. The letter I represented the Internet, which was becoming increasingly important to ordinary consumers. The iMac was designed to make connecting to the Internet easier. It also removed the floppy disk drive, a decision that surprised and angered some customers. Jobs believed floppy disks were becoming outdated. Instead, the iMac used newer technology such as USB connections. This became a familiar Apple strategy: remove an older feature before everyone was ready, then encourage the industry to move forward. The iMac became a commercial success. It showed that customers cared not only about what a computer could do, but also how it looked and how it felt to use. Apple had survived its crisis. Now it began expanding beyond computers. At the beginning of the 2000s, people increasingly stored digital photographs, videos, and music on their computers. Steve Jobs described the computer as a digital hub that could organize and manage all this content. In 2001, Apple released Mac OS X, a new operating system built partly from Next technology. That same year, the company opened its first Apple retail stores. Many experts predicted they would fail. Instead, the stores gave Apple complete control over how its products were presented. Customers could touch the devices, receive demonstrations, attend workshops, and ask employees for technical help. But Apple's most important product of 2001 was small enough to fit inside a pocket. On October 23rd, Apple introduced the iPod. Portable music players already existed, but many were slow, difficult to use, or capable of carrying only a small number of songs. The iPod offered storage for approximately 1,000 songs, quick transfers, and a simple scroll wheel for navigating a music library. Apple promoted it with a memorable promise: 1,000 songs in your pocket. At first, the iPod worked only with Macintosh computers. Later, models supported Windows, became smaller, gained more storage, and appeared in multiple versions. Its white earphones became a symbol of early 2000s popular culture. The iPod transformed Apple from a computer company into a major consumer electronics brand. Digital music was growing, but much of it was shared illegally through file-sharing services. Record companies were searching for a way to sell music online without losing control of their content. In 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Music Store. Customers could legally purchase individual songs, usually for 99 cents, rather than buying an entire physical album. The process was simple: find a song, purchase it, download it, and transfer it to an iPod. Apple had connected the device, the software, and the digital store into one system. This became one of the company's greatest strengths. Instead of selling only individual products, Apple created an ecosystem in which its devices and services worked together. The iPod became enormously successful, but another device threatened to make portable music players unnecessary. Mobile phones were beginning to play music. Instead of waiting for another company to replace the iPod, Apple decided to create its own phone. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and announced 3 new products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and an internet communication device. He repeated the list several times before revealing the surprise. They were not 3 separate products. They were one device: the iPhone. Smartphones already existed, but many used physical keyboards, plastic styluses, tiny buttons, and complicated menus. The iPhone replaced most physical controls with a large multi-touch screen operated using a person's fingers. Users could scroll through lists, zoom into photographs, browse websites, listen to music, view maps, and make phone calls from one device. The original iPhone was far from perfect. It did not have an app store, it could not record video, it lacked copy and paste, and it used a relatively slow mobile network. However, its interface felt dramatically different from other phones. The iPhone made the smartphone feel less like a miniature business computer and more like a personal device anyone could learn to use. It officially went on sale in the United States in June 2007. The device would eventually become Apple's most important product and change the entire mobile phone industry. The iPhone became even more powerful in 2008 when Apple launched the App Store. For the first time, outside developers could create programs and distribute them directly to iPhone users through Apple's store. The phone was no longer limited to the functions Apple had installed at the factory. It could become a game console, camera editor, fitness tracker, navigation system, banking tool, language tutor, or social media platform. Thousands and eventually millions of mobile applications were created. Entire businesses were built around smartphone apps. Transportation, food delivery, online shopping, entertainment, communication, and work became increasingly connected to mobile devices. The App Store turned the iPhone from a product into a platform. Its usefulness could continue expanding long after a customer purchased it. In 2010, Apple introduced another touchscreen device, the iPad. It was larger than an iPhone, but lighter and simpler than most laptops. Some critics joked that it was merely a giant iPhone and questioned whether anyone needed it. However, the larger screen made it useful for watching videos, reading, drawing, browsing the internet, playing games, and giving presentations. Apple sold 1 million iPads within the first month. The product helped establish the modern tablet computer market and brought Apple's touch-based software into homes, schools, hospitals, and businesses. But while Apple was reaching new levels of success, Steve Jobs was becoming seriously ill. On August 24, 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as Apple's chief executive. Tim Cook, who had managed much of Apple's global operations, became the new CEO. Jobs died on October 5, 2011. His death raised a major question. Could Apple continue innovating without the founder whose personality had become deeply connected to the company? Under Tim Cook, Apple continued expanding. The iPhone became larger, faster, and more advanced. The company introduced devices such as AirPods and the Apple Watch. Released in 2015, the Apple Watch combined notifications, communication, fitness tracking, and health monitoring features inside a wrist-worn device. Apple also expanded its digital services. Apple Music competed in music streaming. Apple Pay allowed customers to make payments using their devices. iCloud synchronized photographs, documents, and information across Apple products. Apple TV Plus entered the entertainment industry with original films and television programs. These services created recurring revenue and gave customers more reasons to remain inside Apple's ecosystem. For years, Macintosh computers used processors produced by Intel, but Apple already designed its own chips for the iPhone and iPad. In 2020, the company announced that future Macintosh computers would also use Apple-designed processors. The first was called the M1. Because Apple controlled the computer operating system and processor, it could design them to work together more closely. The M1 offered strong performance while consuming less power, allowing laptops to remain fast without quickly draining their batteries. The transition gave Apple greater control over the future of the Mac and reduced its dependence on an outside processor company. Once again, Apple's strategy was based on integration. Control as much of the experience as possible. In 2024, Apple entered another major product category with the Vision Pro. The headset displayed digital applications and entertainment inside the user's physical environment. People controlled it using their eyes, hands, and voice instead of a traditional mouse or touch screen. Apple described the device as a spatial computer. Its high price and unusual design meant it was not immediately a mainstream product. Whether devices like it will eventually become as important as the Macintosh or iPhone remains uncertain, but it continued Apple's long attempt to change how humans interact with computers. The Macintosh popularized clicking. The iPhone popularized touching. The Vision Pro explored looking and gesturing. Apple's history is not a simple story of continuous success. It is a story of successful computers and failed experiments, brilliant designs, and expensive mistakes. Its founder was pushed out, built another company, and returned when Apple was close to collapse. Apple did not invent the first personal computer, graphical interface, music player, smartphone, tablet, smartwatch, or virtual reality headset. Instead, its greatest talent was combining existing technologies, simplifying them, and presenting them in ways ordinary people wanted to use. What began as a circuit board built by two friends became a global ecosystem carried in pockets, placed on desks, worn on wrists, and used throughout everyday life. Apple's most important idea may not have been one particular product. It was the belief that technology should not only be powerful, it should feel personal.